The stranger came through the bakery door so hard the little brass bell tore loose and skittered across the floorboards, and before it stopped ringing he had crossed the room and laid both fists flat on the counter, rattling every pie tin on the shelf behind it. "I need a wife before morning," he said, not asked. Said it the way a man says a thing he's been dreading out loud for 100 miles. The two women picking over the day-old loaves went still as fence posts. A boy who'd been eyeing the molasses cookies back toward the wall. Everyone in Coldwater knew who he was. Josiah Hale, the burned man out of Ash Hollow, the one folks crossed the road to avoid, the one who came down off the mountain twice a year for salt and shells and nothing else. And here he stood in Sadie Coyle's bakery with his hat crushed in one hand and his voice cracking like green wood. "There's a stage coming at first light," he said. "It's carrying a little girl I've never once laid eyes on. And if I don't have a proper home and a wife standing on that platform when she steps down, a woman named Cordelia Thorne is going to take her back east and I will never see her again." Before you find out what one baker said back to the most feared man in the territory, the question nobody in that room expected. Do me a small kindness and leave a comment telling us where in this country you're listening from, and who it was that first taught you what a family is. Give this story a like so more folks find it. Now let's begin. The wind had been throwing grit against the windows all afternoon, so Sadie Coyle had already latched the shutters on the west side and was wiping flour paste off her forearms when the bell came loose. She was 27 that autumn, though the 2 winters since her husband's death had put a kind of stillness in her that made strangers guess older. She'd built the bakery herself out of a failed dry goods store, board by board, and she'd built her calms the same way, carefully over time out of whatever was lying around. She did not scream when Josiah's fist hit the counter. She'd stopped screaming a long while back, on a spring night she did not let herself think about in daylight. She simply set down her rag, looked at the mountain of a man in front of her, and waited. He was not what the stories said, and he was exactly what they said, both at once. Tall enough that he'd had to duck the lintel. A beard gone half to gray, though he couldn't have been past 35. One side of his jaw and the back of one hand carried the shiny, pulled-tight look of an old burn. His coat had been good once and was ruined now, but it was the eyes that made people give him the road. A pale, worn-out gray, the color of ash after the fire's long dead, and just as empty. Except right now they weren't empty. Right now they were wild with something Sadie recognized, because she'd worn it herself in a mirror once. Pure fear. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you've frightened my customers and knocked down my bell. I'll pay for the bell. That's not the debt I'm worried about." She came around the counter, untying her apron, and nodded the 2 women toward the door. Mrs. Abbott, who helped her mornings, was one of them. Sadie caught her eye, and the older woman understood and shepherded the others out into the wind. When the door had shut and it was just the 2 of them and the smell of cooling bread, Sadie folded her arms. "Say the rest of it," so he told her. His brother Amos had gone farther west than sense allowed, married a girl out of a Kansas church, had a daughter. Then the fever came through their settlement 2 winters running and took first the girl's mother and then Amos himself, a month apart, and the child, Winnie she was called, she was 7, had been passed hand to hand until a letter finally reached the only blood she had left, him, a recluse on a mountain. And with that letter had come a second one, from a lawyer, and a third from the girl's other aunt, the mother's sister, Cordelia Thorne, a widow of considerable means in Philadelphia, who had petitioned the territorial court for custody, and stated plainly that a solitary, disfigured mountain man was no fit guardian for a grieving little girl. The circuit man, a Mr. Pruitt, would come within the fortnight to see the child's situation with his own eyes and rule on it. And the one thing every letter agreed on, the one thing the law leaned on hardest, was that a child wants a mother in the house, a home, not a cabin with one broken man in it and the wind for company. "So you thought," Sadie said, "you'd walk into town and buy one off a shelf." "I thought," he said, and his voice dropped, "that you were the only person in Coldwater who has never once looked at me like I was a thing to be afraid of." He set a small canvas sack on the counter and it clinked. "It don't have to be real. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to stand up in front of the Reverend and put your name on a paper, so that when that little girl comes down those steps tomorrow, there's a woman there, so they can't say there isn't." The bread ticked as it cooled. Outside the wind eased for a moment the way it does before it changes direction. Sadie Coyle was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about a night 10 years gone, when she was 17 and the creek came up faster than anyone had ever seen it, and her little sister Merritt had been out at the far end of the footbridge, and Sadie had frozen, just for a breath, just long enough to think about her own footing, and in that breath the bridge went, and after that there was no Merritt, there was only the water. She had not frozen again in her life. She had made a hard bargain with herself on the muddy bank that night, that whatever else she was, she would not be a woman who waited while a child needed her. She had married a decent, dull man to run from that grief and buried him too, and she had built a bakery to have somewhere to put her hands. And now a wrecked stranger was standing in her shop telling her a 7-year-old was about to be taken away because there was no woman willing to stand on a platform. Not for money, she said finally, and pushed the little sack back across the counter. Josiah's face did something complicated.
Then what?
Conditions. She held up one finger.
You will never lie to that child. Not to spare her feelings.
Not to make yourself look better. Not because the truth is hard. Children know when they're being handled. If she asks how her mother died,
You tell her plain and you let her cry about it. Agreed? Agreed? Second.
another finger. This is my shop. It stays my shop. I've got a widow, Mrs. Abbott, who's been wanting steadier work. She'll take the counter and the morning bake, and I'll ride down twice a week to keep the books and mind the ovens myself. Cold water doesn't lose its bread because you lost your nerve. That's not negotiable. All right. Third. She lowered her hand. You will treat me as a partner in this and not a piece of furniture you hauled up the mountain. If we're going to fool a judge, we'd best not be strangers in front of him. I'll come to the cabin. I'll learn the child. And you'll answer my questions like I'm owed the answers, because I will be. She looked at the burn on his jaw and did not look away from it the way people did, including how you got that. For the first time the fear went out of his eyes and something quieter came into them. The hollow burned 4 years back, he said.
In the summer, I got everybody's stock out. I got the Pruitt boys out and old Coombs out. I didn't get my wife out. He said it flat, the way you say a thing you've said to yourself 10,000 nights. I run back in for her 3 times, and the 3rd time the roof came down. That's the burn. That's the whole of it.
Sadie nodded slowly. She understood him better in that moment than she'd understood her own dead husband in 3 years of marriage. 2 people who'd been too slow once and had spent the rest of their lives running the length of the country away from the sound the water and the fire made. Reverend Hartley closes his house at 9, she said, reaching for her coat. We'd best not knock him up out of bed.
Let's go get married, Mr. Hale.
They stood in the Reverend's front parlor by lamplight with Mrs. Abbott and the Reverend's wife for witnesses, and it took less than 4 minutes. Sadie kept her back straight and her voice even. Josiah's hands shook so hard he dropped the ring, a plain band that had been his mother's, worn thin, and Sadie was the one who picked it up off the rug and put it on her own finger, because he couldn't seem to make his fingers work, and that small thing, her doing it for him, was the first tenderness that had passed between them. Reverend Hartley pronounced them man and wife, and looked like he wanted very much to ask questions and had the good sense not to. Outside the wind had finally died. The stars came out hard and white over Coldwater the way they only do after a dust storm scrubs the sky. The stage came in at 6:10 the next morning, and Sadie stood on the platform in her good gray dress with her hair pinned and her spine like a ramrod, and beside her Josiah Hale looked as though he might be sick. The station master, Rennick, watched them out of the corner of his eye and said nothing. The coach door opened. A conductor handed down a small trunk and then a smaller carpet bag, and then a little girl. Winnie Hale was 7 years old, and she had come the last leg of a 400-mile journey in a brown wool dress that had been let out at the hem and taken in at the shoulders by 3 different hands. Her boots were scuffed pale at the toes. She had her father's coloring and her mother's mouth, though neither of the strangers on the platform could have known that, and she held on to the carpet bag with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her from floating off the edge of the world. She looked at the enormous burned man who was her uncle. She looked at the pale, still woman beside him, and her face closed up like a fist. "You're not my mama," Winnie said. "No," Sadie said.
I'm not. Your mama's gone and there's nobody who can take her place, and I'd be a liar if I said I meant to try. My name is Sadie. That great tall fellow is your Uncle Josiah, your papa's brother. We came to take you home. The child studied her for a long, suspicious moment. Then she looked at the trunk and the carpet bag. "There's not much," she said, half daring them to mind. "There's enough to start," Sadie said, and picked up the trunk before Josiah could, because he was still standing there like a felled tree that hadn't figured out it was down yet. The ride up to Ash Hollow took the better part of the day in the wagon. Sadie talked quietly, not needing to be answered, pointed out the hawks riding the updrafts, named the tumbling creeks, told Winnie which berries you could eat off the roadside, and which would give you a stomachache fit to kill you. Winnie said nothing for the first 2 hours. Then, Small, do you have bears?
And Josiah, who had not managed a word to the child all day, said, "In the winter they mostly sleep. There's a black bear with 2 cubs comes through the aspens every spring. I leave the far apple tree for her, and she leaves my chickens be. We got an understanding." It was the longest thing he'd said, and it was to a 7-year-old about a bear, and Say saw the child's shoulders come down half an inch. The cabin, when they reached it near dusk, surprised her. She'd expected a hovel. It was small but sound, tight-chinked, with a good stone chimney and a plank floor Josiah had clearly sanded by hand. There was a barn with a milk cow and a mule and a dozen speckled hens, a smokehouse, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and a garden gone to seed for the season but plainly tended in its time.
The man might have lived like a ghost, but he'd kept the place like someone still hoping in some corner of himself that a life might yet happen in it.
He'd built a bed for the child in the loft that very week, out of green pine, and beside it he'd set 3 little carved animals on the sill, a fox, a bear, and a rabbit, no bigger than a child's fist, sanded smooth, waiting. Sadie saw Winnie see them. The girl didn't touch them. But that night, after Sadie had heated water and washed the road off her, and found in the carpet bag a nightgown gone soft with 100 washings, worn thin at the cuffs, the last thing Sadie understood that the child's dead mother had ever pressed onto her. After all that, when Sadie tucked the quilt up under the small chin the way she'd once tucked her sister's, the fox and the bear and the rabbit had been moved onto the pillow beside the girl's head. Those first weeks were not gentle. Nobody's ever are. Winnie tested them the way hurt children test the walls of a new house, to find out which ones will hold. She wept in the night and would not be comforted, and then in the daytime she'd go hard and silent, and refuse her supper out of pure fury that her mother was in the ground, and these 2 strangers were not.
She broke a plate on purpose to see what they'd do. She said cruel true things. "You're ugly," to Josiah. "You're not anybody's real mother," to Sadie, and watched to see if the words would send them away like everyone else had gone away. They did not go. Sadie handed Josiah the truth like a tool.
She's not being wicked. She's being terrified. Every grown person she ever loved has left. She's going to keep hitting these walls until she believes they're going to stand. And Josiah, who had thought loving a child would be a thing you knew how to do the way you know how to swing an axe, learned it the hard way, the only way it ever gets learned, by staying. He was clumsy and enormous and gentle. He carved. Every evening after the chores he'd sit by the fire with his knife and a chunk of soft pine and make her something, a horse, a little owl, a leaping trout, and set it on the table without a word, and never once demanded she like it. He learned to braid her hair, his huge scarred fingers slow and careful, and he did it badly for a month, and then, one morning, well, when she woke screaming from the fever dream she'd carried west, the dream where her mother was calling her from another room and she couldn't find the door, it was Josiah who came up the loft ladder and sat on the floor by her bed in the dark, too big for the space, and told her about the mountain. Not stories exactly, just the true shape of the place. How the snow came so deep some winters he had to tunnel to the woodshed. How the elk came down through the pass in the spring with their long-legged calves. How once, in the worst February he'd ever known, a whole family of foxes had denned up under his porch, and he'd fed them scraps all winter, and in the spring the kits had played in his dooryard like it was theirs. His voice was low and rough, and it filled up the dark like wood smoke, and one by one the nights got easier. And Sadie made the cabin a place where a child could believe in breakfast. She rode down to Coldwater twice a week as she'd said she would, and Mrs. Abbott ran the counter clean and honest, and the town never once went without its bread, so that when folks came up later to gossip, there was nothing to say except that the burned man's wife baked the best sourdough in 3 counties and rode her own wagon down the mountain to prove it. In the cabin, she taught Winnie to knead dough and let her punch it as hard as she wanted, which turned out to be a fine thing for a furious child. She sewed the girl 2 new dresses out of good calico bought in town and a wool coat against the coming cold and stout boots a size large to grow into, and she did it where Winnie could watch, so the child would know that things were being made for her, on purpose, by hands that meant to stay. They put up the last of the garden together, the 3 of them, beans and squash into the cellar, herbs to dry from the rafters, and Sadie let Winnie carry the eggs in from the barn each morning and did not scold when one got dropped. On the wall by the door, Josiah cut 3 notches at 3 heights and started marking the girl's growth, and the day he made the first mark, she stood so straight and so proud that both grown-ups had to look somewhere else for a minute. Somewhere in there, Sadie could never afterward name the day, the fooling of the judge stopped being the reason. Somewhere in there she caught herself listening for the wagon at dusk. Somewhere in there, Josiah stopped flinching when she reached past him at the stove. But there was no time to sit and name any of it, because on a cold gray Tuesday in the middle of all this getting better, a hired buggy came grinding up the mountain road with 2 people in it, and the reason ran out of time. Cordelia Thorne came up the path in a traveling dress the color of a bruise, holding her skirts off the good clean dirt of the dooryard like it might soil her. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 50 with a fine jaw and a colder mouth, and grief lived in her too. Sadie saw it the moment she looked past the fur collar and into the eyes, for they were her dead sister's eyes, and they knew it and hated everything they saw. Behind her came Mr. Pruitt, the circuit man, a narrow-tired fellow with an ink-stained satchel and the weary courtesy of someone who has watched a great many families come apart and would rather on the whole they didn't. "So," Cordelia said, looking at the cabin, the woodpile, the burned man in his doorway.
"The mail order arrangement. I'd heard."
"I told the court I'd heard, and I told them a scramble to the altar the very night the child's arrival was known proves the thing exactly for what it is." She turned to Pruitt. "You see it. Sham the moment you look at it."
Sadie stepped out onto the porch and put herself squarely between Cordelia Thorne and the door. "You've come a long way, Mrs.
Thorne," she said, "for a woman who never once wrote to that child in 2 years of her being passed around like a parcel."
Come in. There's coffee. You can say whatever you've come to say to my face, but you'll take your voice down before you cross that threshold because there's a 7-year-old inside who has buried her mother and her father and does not need to hear grown people fighting over her like the last biscuit.
Cordelia's chin came up.
But she took her voice down. Mr. Pruitt did his work thoroughly, and to his credit, honestly.
He walked the property and asked his questions and wrote in his book. He counted the jars in the root cellar and looked at the meat in the smokehouse and the fat hens and the milk cow with a full bag. He asked how many meals the child took a day, and Sadie said 3, and Josiah, without prompting, added that Winnie hadn't cared for eggs when she came and did now, and could tell you the name of every hen. Pruitt asked about her lessons, and Sadie brought out the copybook where she'd been teaching the girl her letters and sums, and on Sundays, reading her the fairy stories out of a book Josiah had ridden 2 days to a bigger town to buy. He asked gently whether the child seemed happy, and Sadie said no, not yet, not all the way, because a child who loses what Winnie's lost doesn't get to be happy on a schedule to suit a court, but that she was mending, a little every day, and that mending couldn't be rushed and couldn't be faked, and he was welcome to watch for it himself. Then he asked to speak with the child alone. They waited in the cold dooryard.
Cordelia sat rigid in a kitchen chair somebody had carried out. Josiah could not be still.
He paced the length of the woodpile and back like the caged thing the town believed him to be, and finally Sadie put her hand flat on his chest to stop him.
"If he takes her," Josiah said low, "he won't." She didn't know it. She said it anyway, because that was the bargain she'd made on a muddy bank at 17.
That she would not stand and shake while a child needed her. Winnie will tell him the truth, and the truth is on our side now, whether that woman likes it or not. But her own heart was going like a trip hammer, and Cordelia Thorne sat there with her sister's eyes and her ruined hope, and the minutes stretched out long as years. The door opened. Mr. Pruitt came out with Winnie's small hand held in his, and the child's face was streaked but calm, and she went straight past all of them and put her arms as far around Josiah's leg as they would reach and held on. Pruitt closed his book. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I'll set it down plain, since we've all come a long way for plain.
When you petitioned, I read a great deal of sense in what you wrote. A widow of means, a fine house, schools, society, every material thing.
Against that, a solitary man on a mountain with a burn on his face and a reputation for keeping a rifle handy. On paper, it was no contest." He rubbed his eyes. "I've done this work 11 years. I've learned the paper lies more than the people do." He looked at the burned man with the child clamped to his leg.
"That girl in there," I asked her if she could go anywhere in this world.
"Where would she go?"
And she said she wanted to stay where somebody had made her a bed before they'd ever seen her face, and had carved her a fox because they didn't yet know what she liked, so they made one of everything. She said her uncle tells her the truth, even when it's hard, and her Aunt Sadie lets her punch the bread. She said, and I'm quoting the child, that this is the first place since her mother died where the grown-ups don't disappear. Pruitt shut the satchel. "That's not something a person can rehearse in 6 weeks, ma'am. That's a home. I'll be recommending the guardianship stand as it is." For a moment Cordelia Thorne did not move. Then something in her fine cold face broke. All at once, the way ice goes off a pond. Not a crack, but a collapse. And she put her gloved hand over her mouth and her shoulders shook. And Sadie understood that this woman had not driven 400 miles for a possession. She'd driven it for the last living piece of a sister she'd lost. And she'd dressed the wanting up in lawyers and disdain, because wanting it plain would have killed her. Sadie crossed the dooryard and crouched beside the fine chair. "Mrs. Thorne," she said quietly, so the child couldn't hear. "Nobody in this world has to lose her. You're her people. You're her mother's own blood. There's a bed here for you whenever you can make the journey, and there's paper and ink enough for 100 letters, and there is a little girl who is going to grow up knowing she had a mother once, who had a sister who loved her enough to fight the whole territory. That's not nothing. That's a gift if you'll let it be one." She held out her flowery, capable hand. "Come inside. There's coffee. And I made a pie yesterday I've been saving for no reason I could have told you until right now." Cordelia Thorne looked at the offered hand for a long time. Then she took it. She stayed 3 days. She read Winnie the fairy stories in a voice that sounded, the child said wonderingly, a little like Mama's. She showed Sadie how her sister had liked her hair done up.
Before the buggy took her back down the mountain, she pressed into Winnie's hands a small silver locket with a curl of her mother's dark hair inside it, and she pressed into Sadie's hands something harder to give.
She said low and rough, I was wrong about him, about all of it.
Thank you for not being the thing I came here so ready to hate. Then she was gone down the road, and she wrote every month for the rest of her life, and she came every summer, and in time she was simply Aunt Cordelia, who arrived in July with peppermints and Philadelphia manners, and a growing, grudging love for a mountain she'd once looked at like it was the edge of the earth.
As for the two who'd married in 4 frightened minutes in a reverend's parlor, the truth crept up on them the way spring creeps up on that valley, so slow you can't say the day it turned.
Only that one morning the world is green. There came an evening in the deep of that first winter, when the snow was banked to the windowsills, and Winnie was asleep in the loft with a whole ark of carved animals now, and Sadie was mending by the fire, and Josiah was oiling a harness, and neither of them was saying anything, and the silence was not the silence of strangers keeping to their sides of a bargain. It was the other kind, the kind that's full. Josiah set down the harness and looked at her a long moment across the firelight and said, in the voice of a man stepping onto ice he isn't sure will hold, I didn't marry you for the reasons I said. And Sadie, who had learned at 17 never to freeze when the thing that mattered was right in front of her, set down her mending and said, I know, I didn't stay for them either, and that was all. That was the whole of it. Some things don't need more words than that. They were married again the next June, in the meadow above the cabin with the wild lupine out, and this time Sadie cried and Josiah's hands didn't shake, and Winnie stood between them, holding the ring in her cupped palms like it was a live thing, and Cordelia Thorne wept in the front row, and Mrs. Abbott made 3 kinds of cake, and Mr. Pruitt, who had somehow gotten himself invited, said it was the only wedding in 11 years he'd have driven 100 miles just to see. There would be a boy 2 years on, and a second girl after that, and the notches on the doorframe would climb and climb. Josiah Hale would carry his burns to the end of his days on his jaw and his hand, and deeper than that where nobody could see. But he learned to live inside them instead of being sealed up inside them, and he became the father his brother would have wanted for that child, patient and present and quick to say when he'd been wrong. And Sadie carried her sister Merritt with her always, but somewhere along the years the grief turned from a stone. She dragged into something more like a hand at her back, pushing her toward the people who were still here to be reached for. She had promised a dead girl on a muddy bank that she would never again stand still while a child needed her, and she had kept it in the biggest way a person can. Years and years on, when Winnie was grown and married with children of her own tugging at her skirts, she brought them up the mountain to the old cabin every summer. She showed them the fox and the bear and the rabbit, still on the windowsill, sanded smooth by 60 years of small hands. She showed them the notches marching up the doorframe. She told them how 3 broken people had been thrown together by a train and a lie and a great deal of fear, and had somehow, without ever quite deciding to, fitted the sharp edges of themselves against one another until the fitting held. That was all a family ever was, she told them. Not folks who matched, but folks who kept fitting the pieces back together, patient every single day, until the cracks stopped being weakness and started being the very thing that made the whole strong enough to carry the weight of love. The cabin stands there yet, in that high green valley, and on quiet evenings, if you're the sort who listens, you can just about hear it. The laughter of people who found out that the bravest, hardest, most ordinary thing a soul can do is refuse to disappear.